In the winter of 1944, somewhere behind the Allied front lines in the European theater, a German soldier stood alive only by accident. He had been captured during a collapsing defense, stripped of his rifle, his insignia, and finally his certainty. The war had taught him many things, but none prepared him for the quiet terror of captivity, the moment when the fighting stopped and judgment began. He understood the rumors. Prisoners disappeared. Guards looked the other way. Paperwork lagged behind reality. In a war that had already buried millions, one more name could vanish without consequence. For the first time since his induction, his fate no longer depended on orders he followed, but on strangers who owed him nothing. Like many prisoners, he assumed the worst. He had seen the faces of American guards, young, tired, hardened by months of combat. These were men who had lost friends to German bullets and mines. Mercy, he believed, was not written into their duty. Survival meant compliance, silence, invisibility. He told himself that if he did not draw attention, he might endure. But war rarely respects plans. In the confusion of the camp, crowded barracks shouted commands, a system strained by the sheer volume of captives, the German soldier found himself singled out. Whether by suspicion, error, or chance, the situation escalated quickly. Raised voices replaced procedure. The rules that governed prisoners blurred under pressure. What should have been routine began to tilt toward something irreversible. Then, unexpectedly, a single American guard stepped forward. He was not an officer. He carried no authority beyond his uniform and the rifle slung over his shoulder. Yet he saw what others did not, or chose not to ignore. He intervened calmly, firmly, insisting on process where chaos threatened to rule. The moment passed without ceremony, no speech, no gratitude exchanged. The German prisoner was returned to the line alive. Both men remained bound by the machinery of war. One would continue guarding prisoners. The other would continue being one. Neither imagined that this brief interruption, this insistence on restraint, meant anything beyond the day itself. Yet history often turns not on grand strategies, but on quiet decisions made by ordinary men. And long after the war ended, when uniforms were folded away and enemies became citizens again, this single act of compassion would surface once more, carrying consequences no one in that camp could have foreseen. Because far from that wire enclosure, years in the future, the saved life would intersect with another, one that would carry the memory of this moment into an entirely different war. By 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had filled improvised prisoner-of-war camps faster than they could be properly organized. Barbed wire cut through open fields and abandoned farmland. Wooden watchtowers rose where cattle once grazed. For the German soldiers held inside, life narrowed to a schedule of counts, rations, and waiting. Their days were no longer shaped by strategy or command, but by rules enforced at close range, often without explanation. The camps were not designed for comfort, nor were they insulated from the brutal arithmetic of war. Food was scarce. Medical care was uneven. Winter pressed through thin walls and thinner blankets. Disease spread easily among men weakened by months of combat and retreat. Mortality, while rarely documented in detail, was an understood presence, an accepted consequence of overcrowding and exhaustion. Survival depended as much on circumstance as compliance. Hatred lingered in the air. Many American guards had marched past the bodies of friends killed by German fire. The prisoners, for their part, carried their own fears of reprisal, of neglect, of quiet punishment beyond the wire. Officially, the Geneva Convention governed their treatment. Unofficially, much rested on the character of the men enforcing it. In that space between policy and practice, lives could be lost or spared. It was here that the American guard made his choice. To intervene on behalf of a German prisoner was not an act without risk. Fellow guards might question his loyalty or resolve. Superiors might view restraint as weakness. In wartime, mercy was often mistaken for hesitation, and hesitation could cost lives. Yet he understood that discipline did not require cruelty, and that order, once abandoned, rarely returned intact. The decision unfolded quietly. A correction offered instead of force. A regulation cited instead of ignored. The guard insisted that the rules apply, even when emotion urged otherwise. In doing so, he protected a prisoner not because he was German, but because he was human, and because the war, for all its violence, had not erased that distinction. The German prisoner survived not by luck, nor by the anonymity of the camp, but because one man chose to act against the prevailing current. It was a moment unnoticed by history, unrecorded in our reports or commendations. Yet that choice did not end at the fence line. Years later, far from the wire and watchtowers, the consequence of this mercy would resurface, crossing borders, generations, and another battlefield entirely, where the meaning of that decision would finally be revealed. The moment came without warning. A misunderstanding hardened into accusation. Hands tightened on weapons. In the compressed world of the camp, events moved faster than procedure could restrain them. For the German prisoner, the distance between standing and dying collapsed into a few irreversible seconds. There would be no appeal, no record, no witness beyond the wire. Then the American guard intervened. His voice cut through the tension, sharp enough to halt the motion already in progress. He placed himself between intention and consequence, insisting that the situation stop, now. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a refusal. In war, such refusals are uncommon because they challenge the momentum that violence builds so easily. Compassion rarely announces itself on the battlefield. It arrives quietly, often unrecognized, and disappears just as quickly. Most acts of mercy leave no trace in official histories. They are not rewarded, and sometimes they are punished. The guard knew this. He understood that stepping in could isolate him from his peers, mark him as unreliable or worse, naive. Yet he acted anyway. The irony was complete and invisible in that instant. This brief interruption, measured in seconds, would not simply preserve a life. It would alter it. The prisoner would walk away from that moment carrying more than survival. He would carry a memory that challenged everything the war had taught him about enemies and inevitability. The guard returned to his post. There was no acknowledgement, no gratitude exchanged. Duty resumed its familiar shape. Orders were followed. The camp settled back into its uneasy routine. To anyone watching, nothing of significance had occurred. But for the man who had nearly died, the world had shifted. He lived because one individual chose restraint where violence was permitted, and principle where indifference would have sufficed. The war would continue to claim its victims. Front lines would move. Nations would fall and rise. Yet this single life, preserved against expectation, would now move forward into an uncertain peace. Neither man could have imagined what lay ahead. The prisoner would return to a rebuilt world, carrying the weight of survival. The guard would resume his life, likely never knowing the outcome of his choice. And decades later, when the echoes of the Second World War had faded into history, that decision would surface again, its consequences reaching into another conflict, another generation, where the meaning of mercy would finally reveal itself. Survival in the camp had never felt guaranteed. Each day carried its own quiet hazards: illness, misjudgment, exhaustion, indifference. And yet the German prisoner was alive. Not because the war had softened, nor because conditions had improved, but because one moment of intervention had broken the pattern that claimed so many others. He now moved through the camp with the knowledge that his life existed on borrowed time, preserved by a decision he had not controlled. That knowledge altered everything. He slept differently, aware of how close the line had been. He listened more closely to footsteps and voices, understanding how quickly order could dissolve. The near-death experience did not make him fearless. It made him precise. Each day was endured with a heightened awareness that survival was no longer abstract. It had been negotiated once and might not be again. The greatest shock was not that he had lived, but why. The man who had stepped forward wore the uniform of the enemy. Until that moment, uniforms had defined morality with brutal simplicity. They divided the world into threats and allies, targets and comrades. Yet the intervention had come not from a fellow prisoner, nor from chance, but from an American guard who had chosen restraint over resentment. The categories the prisoner had relied upon no longer held. The irony settled slowly. The war had taught him to fear this man. Instead, this man had saved him. When the fighting ended and the camps dissolved, both men returned to lives reshaped by the war, though neither spoke publicly of that day. The German prisoner went home to a country in ruins, burdened by defeat and memory. He rebuilt what he could: work, family, routine, carrying with him the quiet weight of survival. The American guard resumed civilian life, one veteran among millions, his act unrecorded and unrewarded. Neither sought recognition, neither expected consequence. Yet memory has a way of enduring where documentation fails. The German survivor did not forget the face, the voice, or the moment when death had been refused on his behalf. Over the years, that memory hardened into something else. No. Guilt, not gratitude alone, but obligation. a sense that a life spared carried a responsibility beyond mere continuation. Decades passed, the world shifted. New conflicts replaced old ones. Generations grew up with the Second World War reduced to textbooks and ceremonies. Still, the ripple from that camp did not disappear. It waited, dormant but intact, carried forward by the man who had lived when he should not have. Because far in the future, in a different war fought on distant soil, that single act of humanity would return, reflected through another life, another uniform, and another moment where mercy and survival would intersect once more. The war ended not with clarity, but with exhaustion. In the spring of 1945, the gates of the camps opened as the front lines dissolved and orders lost their urgency. The German prisoner was released into a landscape stripped of certainty. Cities lay fractured. Rail lines led nowhere familiar. Victory and defeat meant little to men who had simply endured. He walked out carrying no possessions of value, only the knowledge that he had survived a war that had consumed nearly everyone he had known. Home was no longer what he remembered. The Germany he returned to was quieter, poorer, and marked by absence. Buildings stood hollowed by fire. Families were divided by graves and borders. Like millions of others, he learned to live among ruins, reconstructing a future from fragments. He did not speak often of the camp. Some memories were too narrow, too sharp to share. The American Guard returned home as well. His war ended not at a gate, but on a ship bound west, carrying him back to a civilian life that felt strangely unreal. The uniform was folded away. The rifle surrendered. He became a veteran among millions, encouraged to look forward rather than linger. The moment in the camp faded into the background, neither celebrated nor regretted, simply one decision among many made in uniform. They parted without farewell, without names exchanged, without expectation of reunion. In wartime, survival rarely leaves room for sentiment. The belief was simple and practical. Their lives had intersected briefly, and now they would move on, forever separated by geography and time. Yet the irony endured. Though they never met again, their fates remained quietly linked. The German survivor lived because of that guard's restraint. Every year he aged, every child born into his family, every ordinary day added to his life traced back to a single refusal of violence. The American Guard, unaware of these outcomes, carried on without knowing how far his action had traveled. Both men struggled in ways invisible to others. One bore the gratitude of survival, mixed with the weight of having been spared when so many were not. The other lived with no sense of consequence at all, never knowing that his decision had shaped another man's entire future. Time moved forward, indifferent to both. The war receded into history. New conflicts replaced old ones. The world rebuilt itself without reference to that camp or its wire. But history is not always finished when the guns fall silent. Because decades later, in a different war and a different uniform, the echo of that long-ago mercy would return, waiting for the moment when two lives, separated by half a century, would unknowingly meet again through its consequences. As the years passed, the German survivor learned that time does not diminish memory, it refines it. The war receded into photographs, anniversaries, and fading scars, yet one moment remained unnaturally clear. He could still recall the sound of boots on frozen ground, the tension in the air, the voice that interrupted what seemed inevitable. Survival had given him years, but memory gave those years their weight. He reflected often on the kindness that had spared him, not as sentiment but as disturbance. The intervention did not fit the war's logic. Enemies were not meant to protect one another. Mercy was not meant to appear where violence had been permitted, and yet it had. The moment challenged the clean divisions the war had imposed, forcing him to confront a more unsettling truth, that humanity had survived even where ideology had failed. The shock was not immediate. It arrived slowly as the decades unfolded. As he watched new conflicts erupt across the world, he recognized the same language of certainty, the same belief that uniforms defined morality. Each time his thoughts returned to the camp and to the man who had refused that simplicity. The memory shaped his understanding of guilt, survival, and obligation, even when he never spoke of it aloud. The irony endured quietly. A single act of mercy continued to influence his life, yet it remained invisible to everyone else. There were no records, no witnesses, no proof that it had ever occurred. To the world, he was simply another man who had lived through the war. Only he understood how narrow the margin had been and how deliberately it had been preserved. The American Guard carried his own memory, though less sharply defined. The war became something he rarely discussed, folded into a broader story of service and return. Yet the image of that day never fully vanished. It surfaced in moments of reflection, an unanswered question about what might have happened had he remained silent. He would never know the outcome. He only knew the choice he had made. Both men bore the burden of that moment in different ways. One lived because of it. The other lived having made it. Neither could measure its reach, and neither imagined it extended beyond their own lives. But history often moves along paths unseen. Because even after half a century, the echo of that intervention remained intact, carried forward by bloodlines, shaped by circumstance, and waiting for the moment when the past would surface once more, not as memory, but as recognition. The German survivor built his post-war life slowly, as one builds after a storm, piece by piece, with caution and memory close at hand. The war had taught him how easily systems collapse and how fragile certainty can be. But it was the moment in captivity, not the battles, that lingered most persistently. He carried it into his work, his family, and the quiet judgments he made about the world. Survival was no longer merely a fact of endurance, it was a responsibility. He learned to distrust absolutes. Before the camp, he had believed what the war required him to believe, that enemies were fixed and that hatred was justified by uniform alone. Afterward, that clarity dissolved. He had seen proof that choice still existed inside even the most rigid systems. Trust did not come easily, but when it did, it was deliberate. Forgiveness, too, became less abstract. It was no longer a moral ideal, but a lived experience. The irony followed him quietly. One day, brief, undocumented, almost invisible, had redirected the course of an entire lifetime. He raised children who never knew how narrowly their existence had been avoided. He formed friendships, built routines, and aged into ordinary days, all tracing back to a moment when an enemy had refused to let him die. The war took many things from him, but it also left him with an understanding few others possessed. Memories of conflict never disappeared. They surfaced in newsreels, anniversaries, and the familiar rhetoric of new wars framed as necessary and absolute. Yet against those echoes stood the memory of the guard's voice, measured, controlled, unwilling to surrender to impulse. That recollection became a quiet reference point, a reminder that history is not driven solely by forces larger than men, but by men themselves acting within those forces. He did not speak often of the camp. The story felt too precise, too easily misunderstood. To tell it was to risk having it reduced to sentiment or coincidence. Instead, he lived it, in the way he treated strangers, in the patience he extended where impatience was easier, in the belief that dignity could be preserved even under pressure. The mercy he had received did not make him naive, it made him exacting about his own choices. The act that saved him became a private compass. When faced with moments that allowed indifference, he remembered restraint. When authority offered permission to look away, he remembered intervention. He understood that compassion did not require approval, and that its absence could be justified by nearly any system willing to excuse it. Years turned into decades. The Second World War passed from memory into history, its veterans thinning with each passing year. The survivor aged with the quiet knowledge that his life stood as evidence of something rarely recorded, that even in total war, humanity had not been entirely extinguished. He did not know if the guard had lived a long life or whether he ever reflected on that day. He did not know if the decision had troubled him or if it had faded into the blur of service. The lack of closure did not diminish the meaning. Some connections are not meant to be completed. They exist simply to prove that they once did. Long before any reunion, long before recognition or revelation, the POW's life itself became the testament. Not dramatic, not visible, but enduring. And somewhere beyond his knowing, the consequence of that compassion continued its journey, moving forward through time, through another generation, toward a moment when history would no longer remain silent, and the meaning of that single choice would finally come into view. 50 years passed with little ceremony. Empires dissolved, borders shifted. The war that had once defined an entire generation receded into archives and memory. For the two men bound by that moment in a prisoner of war camp, time moved forward as it does for most, quietly, persistently, without regard for what had once seemed decisive. Yet the bond remained, dormant but intact, carried silently through decades neither could fully explain. And both men aged into different worlds. The German survivor watched his country rebuild itself from rubble into stability, the scars of war gradually replaced by prosperity and routine. The American Guard witnessed his own nation cycle through conflicts that bore different names but familiar patterns. Each lived an ordinary life shaped by family, work, and aging bodies, while carrying an unspoken respect for the other, an awareness of a shared moment that could not be easily categorized or concluded. They did not search for one another. Gratitude, in this case, did not require reunion. The survivor understood that the guard might never know the outcome of his choice, and perhaps that was fitting. The guard, for his part, had no reason to believe his intervention had reached beyond the day itself. Both accepted the uncertainty, allowing the memory to exist without resolution. The irony was complete. The world had moved on from the war that had brought them together, yet the consequences of a single act endured far longer than treaties or ceasefires. History recorded battles and commanders. It rarely noted the quiet refusals that redirected individual lives. This was one such refusal, still exerting its influence long after the context that produced it had disappeared. Gradually, circumstances began to shift. As the 50th anniversary of the war's end approached, nations turned again to remembrance. Veterans were invited to speak. Survivors were asked to testify. Stories long held in silence were encouraged into the open, not for strategy or justification, but for understanding. The German survivor, now an old man, felt the weight of time narrowing his options. Some truths, he realized, would soon have no witnesses left to carry them. He began to speak cautiously at first, about captivity, about survival, about the moment that had altered his life. The story traveled quietly, moving through historians, veterans groups, and memorial organizations. It did not seek attention. It sought connection. Names were uncertain, details were partial, but the outline remained unmistakable. On the other side of the ocean, the American guard encountered a question he had never expected to hear. A request for confirmation. A date, a place, a fragment of memory that had never entirely faded. At first, it seemed improbable. 50 years was a long time for a moment to wait. Yet the more he listened, the more the shape of that day returned with clarity. The struggle was not logistical, but emotional. To reopen the past was to confront a younger self, acting under pressures that no longer existed. It was to learn that a decision once made without expectation had endured beyond his knowing. Acceptance required humility and perhaps a reckoning with the weight of having mattered. History, it seemed, was not finished. As letters were exchanged and arrangements considered, the distance between the camp and the present narrowed. What had been silent for half a century now edged toward acknowledgement. The war that had once separated them was no longer the barrier it had been. And somewhere between memory and present day, fate completed its slow work, preparing to bring together two lives that history had once aligned, separated, and now, improbably, was about to reunite. The search did not begin with certainty. It began with unease, the awareness that time was running out. The German survivor had lived long enough to see history turn inward, to watch the Second World War recede into abstraction. The faces were disappearing. The voices were thinning. What remained of that camp, of that moment, existed almost entirely within him. And so the struggle took shape not as urgency, but as resolve. If the story was to endure, it would have to leave him. He spoke carefully, resisting embellishment. Dates were uncertain. Names were incomplete. What he had was memory, precise in emotion, imprecise in record, a guard, an intervention, a refusal that had interrupted death. He reached out through veterans' associations, historians, and quiet inquiries, unsure whether the thread he followed still existed. Many searches ended in silence. Some ended in polite skepticism. After 50 years, memory itself was often treated as unreliable. Yet memory was all he had. The irony of the search was unavoidable. The man who had saved him might not remember the act at all. For the guard, it had been a moment among thousands, one decision in a war defined by decisions made under pressure. For the survivor, it had been the dividing line between existence and absence. One life carried the memory like a compass. The other may have folded it away as routine. As fragments surfaced, the story began to move beyond the private. It passed from the survivor's voice into the hands of others who recognized its significance, not as drama, but as evidence. Evidence that even within total war, restraint had survived, that the moral landscape had never been as simple as history often suggests. Each retelling sharpened the outline, each question narrowed the distance. Across the ocean, the American veteran encountered the past unexpectedly. A letter, a phone call, a careful inquiry framed with uncertainty. At first it seemed implausible. Too much time had passed, too many details were blurred, yet certain facts resisted dismissal: the place, the conditions, the emotional weight that accompanied the account. Slowly, the memory returned, not as spectacle, but as recognition. The struggle shifted. It was no longer about finding someone lost to time, but about accepting what had been found. For the guard, the revelation carried its own burden. To learn that a moment long dismissed as ordinary had shaped another man's entire life required recalibration. It forced him to confront the scale of consequence that can accompany even restrained action. The intervention had not ended at the camp. It had traveled forward unseen. Through decades he had lived unaware of its reach. For the survivor, the growing certainty brought something like calm. The story was no longer his alone. It had begun to exist outside him, independent of his memory. Closure did not mean gratitude expressed or acknowledgement received. It meant knowing that the act had not vanished, that it had been real, witnessed, and understood. The reunion, once unimaginable, became inevitable not through force but through convergence. Records aligned, timelines matched, willingness replaced doubt. The war that had once separated them no longer dictated terms. What remained was two men approaching the same truth from opposite ends of time. History had waited patiently. Because acts of compassion do not expire when unrecognized. They persist, quietly shaping outcomes long after their context has vanished. And now, after half a century of silence, the consequences of that single refusal were about to step into the open, bringing with them a meeting that neither man had expected, but both, in different ways, had been carrying toward all along. The discovery did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as though history itself were uncertain whether it should reveal the answer at all. After decades of partial records and fading recollections, the German survivor was finally given a name. An American soldier, a unit, a place in time that could be verified. The man who had once stood between him and death was no longer a silhouette in memory, but a living identity. The shock was not disbelief, but gravity. For half a century, the guard had existed as a figure defined by action alone, a voice, a presence, a refusal. To learn that he was real, traceable, and still alive forced the survivor to confront the weight of what he had carried alone for so long. The story had not ended in the camp. It had merely been paused, waiting for this moment to resume. With the name came hesitation. Gratitude, long contained, now required expression, yet the survivor did not know how such words would be received after 50 years. He had lived an entire life shaped by that intervention. The guard, he suspected, might have lived his without ever knowing the outcome. To reach out was to risk indifference, confusion, or discomfort. Silence, after all, had been the easier choice for decades. Still, he chose to act. The first contact was careful, restrained by uncertainty on both sides. A letter, a conversation mediated by others. The facts were presented without embellishment. Dates, locations, a single incident in a crowded camp. The response, when it came, was measured, not disbelief, but recognition. Memory returned slowly, aligning with the account not through detail, but through feeling. The day resurfaced, no longer isolated, but connected. The irony was unmistakable. Time had erased so much. Cities rebuilt, borders redrawn, generations replaced. Yet it had not weakened the bond forged in that brief moment of restraint. The distance of decades had not diminished its significance. If anything, it had clarified it. What had seemed ordinary then now appeared extraordinary in hindsight, precisely because it had required no expectation of reward. Plans for a reunion emerged cautiously, shaped by age and circumstance. Neither man was young. The journey itself required effort. Health, logistics, and the quiet apprehension of meeting one's past all weighed heavily, yet there was no sense of obligation, only resolve. History had aligned their lives once before. Now it offered a second convergence, this time without barbed wire or uniforms between them. The turning point was not the decision to meet, but the realization of what that meeting represented. This was not reconciliation between enemies, nor a ceremonial act staged for history. It was acknowledgement, proof that a choice made under pressure had mattered, that it had endured, and that it had shaped a life beyond its moment. When they finally stood together, two old men marked by time rather than war, the encounter was subdued. There were no speeches, no rehearsed expressions of gratitude. What passed between them did not require performance. It existed in shared understanding. The survivor spoke of life granted. The guard spoke of duty remembered. Neither claimed heroism. Both recognized humanity. The revelation extended beyond them. Their reunion became testimony not to the war they had survived, but to the moral possibility that had existed within it. that even in systems designed for destruction, individual restraint could alter outcomes far beyond its immediate scope. The moment belonged not only to them, but to history itself, a reminder that decency does not vanish in war. It waits for those willing to act upon it. 50 years had passed, but the meaning had not faded. And as they parted once more, this time by choice rather than circumstance, the story finally completed its long arc, closing not with triumph or tragedy, but with quiet confirmation that one human decision made in silence had echoed across half a century and returned, intact, to where it began. When the two men finally met, it was not history that spoke first, but silence. Decades of distance, memory, and restraint gathered in a single room, compressing time until the war no longer felt far away. They were no longer soldier and prisoner, no longer guard and captive. They were two aging men confronting a moment that had lived with them longer than most of their memories. The struggle was not in what to say, but in how to begin. Gratitude surfaced slowly, weighed down by years of containment. The German survivor carried words he had rehearsed privately for half a lifetime, unsure whether they would still be welcome. Relief followed close behind, relief that the moment had arrived at all, that the story had not ended in silence. Sorrow, too, lingered for those who had not survived to see such an ending. The reunion did not erase the war. It carried it forward carefully, without denial. The irony was unmistakable. These men had once stood on opposite sides of a conflict that consumed continents. One wore the uniform of conquest, the other that of liberation. In the narrow logic of war, they should have remained enemies forever. Yet here they stood, joined not by victory or defeat, but by restraint. The labels that had once defined them no longer applied. When they spoke, their stories aligned not through detail, but through understanding. The guard recalled the pressure of the camp, the moment when action felt necessary rather than heroic. The prisoner described the sudden clarity of survival, the knowledge that life had been returned rather than spared by chance. Each filled in the other's silence, bridging the years with memory rather than explanation. The turning point came not with acknowledgement, but with recognition. They understood that the moment they shared had never belonged solely to either of them. It existed between them, shaped by circumstance but defined by choice. The guard had acted without expectation. The prisoner had lived with consequence. Together, they completed a story that neither could have finished alone. The meeting transformed something private into something enduring. Friendship emerged not from shared ideology or experience, but from mutual respect earned under the most difficult conditions. They spoke not as former enemies, but as witnesses to a truth that history often overlooks, that reconciliation does not begin with treaties, but with individuals willing to see one another clearly. The reunion resonated beyond the room. It became a symbol, though neither man sought that role. Their presence challenged simplified narratives of war, reminding those who listened that moral clarity is not owned by nations or uniforms. It survives unpredictably in moments where power is restrained and humanity is chosen. There were no declarations, no attempt to frame the meeting as extraordinary. That was its strength. The conversation unfolded with humility, shaped by age and reflection. Both men understood that the war had taken much from them, but it had not taken everything. Something had remained intact, quiet, unnoticed, but decisive. As the meeting drew to a close, there was no sense of finality, only continuity. They parted knowing that the story no longer rested in memory alone. It had been spoken, witnessed, and understood. The silence that once surrounded it had been replaced by acknowledgement. The reunion stood as living proof that compassion can outlast conflict and time, that a single decision made without audience or reward can endure across decades and return with meaning intact, not as legend, not as sentiment, but as fact. And in that quiet confirmation, the long arc of the story found its center, where war had once divided, and a single act of humanity had, patiently and irrevocably, brought two lives back together. The effects of the reunion extended beyond the two men who had carried the store. Why for half a century? In its wake, families listened to accounts they had never fully known, and communities encountered a history that resisted simple conclusions. What had once been a private reckoning now unfolded outward, offering a form of closure that neither man had expected. The war, long finished on paper, released one of its final burdens. For the German survivor's family, the reunion reframed a life they had always taken for granted. Children and grandchildren learned that their existence rested on a moment of restraint performed by a stranger in uniform. The story altered the way the past was spoken of, not as inheritance of guilt or defeat, but as testimony to survival shaped by conscience. It transformed silence into understanding, and understanding into gratitude that reached across generations. The American Guard's family experienced a similar reckoning. They had known him as a veteran, a father, a man of routine decency. They had not known the scale of what he had done. The reunion did not elevate him into legend, but it deepened the meaning of his ordinary life. A decision once made without audience now carried visible consequence, revealing how quietly held values can outlast the circumstances that test them. The irony was unavoidable. A war defined by destruction had produced a story of repair. What began amid barbed wire and suspicion now stood as an account of hope, forgiveness, and shared humanity. The brutality that framed the original moment did not erase its gentler outcome. Instead, it sharpened it, proof that compassion had not merely survived the war, but emerged from its most unforgiving spaces. As the men reflected together, neither claimed moral exceptionalism. They spoke instead of context, pressure, and uncertainty. The guard recalled how easily he could have remained silent. The prisoner spoke of how close life had come to ending without witness or meaning. Between them lay an understanding that history is not only shaped by grand movements, but by small actions taken when no recognition is promised. That realization marked the turning point. Both men came to see that their story was not remarkable because it was rare, but because it was possible. The intervention had required no special authority, no defiance of orders, only the decision to apply restraint where violence was permitted. Its consequences, however, had been expansive. One life had been preserved. Another had been altered by the knowledge of having preserved it. The reunion allowed that truth to settle fully. What had once been a memory carried in isolation now stood confirmed, shared, and released. The weight of wondering, of whether the act had mattered, of whether it had been real, lifted from both men. Closure did not mean forgetting. It meant no longer carrying the story alone. The revelation reached outward into the present. Audiences who heard the account encountered a different language of war, one that did not deny suffering or responsibility, but insisted that choice remained even under extreme conditions. The story did not excuse history. It complicated it. It reminded listeners that enmity is constructed, but humanity persists. The act of mercy, once confined to a frozen moment in 1944, continued to resonate precisely because it had not sought to. Its power lay in its ordinariness. It was not symbolic when it occurred. It became symbolic only because it endured, through survival, through memory, through the slow convergence of two lives across 50 years. In the end, healing did not arrive as resolution of the past, but as integration of it. The war remained what it was, violent, catastrophic, irreversible. Yet within it, something had resisted destruction. That resistance had taken the form of a single choice, made quietly without certainty of outcome. Time had tested it, history had obscured it, distance had nearly erased it. And still it remained. The story closed not with triumph, but with confirmation that human kindness, once exercised, does not disappear. It moves forward, shaping lives long after the moment has passed, transcending uniform, nation, and enmity. What began as mercy had become meaning. And in that meaning, the war finally loosened its grip. The consequences of that single act of mercy did not conclude with a reunion, nor did they belong solely to the two men who had carried it for so long. Its reach extended outward, quietly and persistently, into lives that had never seen the wire of a prison camp or heard the commands of war. Families inherited its effects without knowing their origin. Communities absorbed its meaning without recording its source. History, once again, moved forward shaped by something it did not name. For the German survivors' descendants, the story altered the way the past was understood. The war no longer existed only as catastrophe or defeat, but as the setting for an intervention that made their lives possible. Gratitude became generational, detached from ideology and rooted instead in an individual choice. It did not erase history's burdens, but it reframed them, proof that even within collective failure, personal responsibility had mattered. The American Guard's family encountered a similar inheritance. They learned that decency, practiced without witnesses, could travel farther than ambition or recognition. The reunion did not elevate him into a symbol he had never sought to become. Instead, it clarified something quieter, that the measure of a life is not found in moments of triumph, but in moments of restraint, when power is available and deliberately unused. The irony endured with particular force. In a war defined by scale, armies, industries, ideologies, the most enduring outcome emerged from a gesture so small it barely registered at the time. No orders were changed. No battles were altered. And yet the trajectory of multiple lives bent permanently because one man refused to let violence proceed unchecked. This is how history often works, though it rarely admits it. Violence announces itself. It demands attention, documentation, commemoration. Compassion, by contrast, operates quietly. It leaves no ruins, no statistics. Its presence is inferred only by what does not happen, by the life that continues, the family that forms, the future that remains open. Its legacy is not immediate, and so it is easily overlooked. Yet over decades, the evidence accumulates. The act of mercy did not end the war. It did not redeem it, but it resisted its totality. It demonstrated that even in systems designed to remove choice, choice persists. That even when hatred is justified, it is not compulsory. The shadow cast by that decision lengthened with time, touching people who would never know the circumstances that produced it. This is the deeper revelation of the story. Violence dominates memory because it is loud and final. Compassion endures because it is generative. It multiplies rather than concludes. One life saved becomes many lives lived. One moment of restraint becomes a standard against which future choices are measured. The war ended, as wars do, with exhaustion and compromise. The kindness within it never required an ending. It simply continued. The two men at the center of the story did not set out to change history. One acted because it felt necessary. The other lived because he was allowed to. Everything that followed unfolded without design. That absence of intention is precisely what gives the story its weight. Meaning was not imposed. It emerged. In the long shadow of that choice, the war appears differently, not softened, not forgiven, but complicated. It remains a landscape of destruction, yet within it stands evidence that humanity was not entirely consumed. That something essential endured, waiting not for recognition, but for consequence. And so the final truth is not about reunion or forgiveness or even reconciliation. It is simpler and more demanding. That in moments where violence feels inevitable, restraint is still possible. That in times defined by enmity, humanity does not disappear, it waits. And that the smallest act, made without hope of reward, can outlast the loudest forces of history. They laughed once. They never laughed again. History often reserves its highest praise for those who conquer, advance, or destroy. Medals are cast for victories measured in ground taken or enemies defeated. Yet the story of these two men asks history to pause and reconsider what it means to be heroic. Neither altered the course of a battle. Neither commanded troops or changed strategy. And yet both demonstrated a form of courage rarer than aggression, the courage to preserve life when destruction was permitted. The German survivor was never celebrated as a hero in the traditional sense. He did not escape captivity, sabotage the enemy, or return home triumphant. His heroism, if it can be called that, lay in endurance, living responsibly with a life that had been deliberately spared. He carried survival not as entitlement, but as obligation. Over decades, he honored that obligation quietly, shaping his choices with an awareness that existence itself had once been denied and then returned. The American Guard was likewise unsung. His intervention earned no citation, no commendation, no place in official records. At the time, it may not have seemed exceptional at all. Yet moral courage rarely announces itself. It operates without witnesses, without applause, and often without reassurance. To step forward in that moment required not defiance of orders, but fidelity to principle, a willingness to apply restraint where force would have gone unquestioned. The irony is unavoidable. In a war defined by violence, the most enduring legacy emerged not from combat, but from mercy. The act that mattered most was not one that ended a life, but one that refused to do so. This inversion unsettles conventional narratives of heroism, challenging the belief that courage is proven honorable. Why through confrontation? Their story reminds us that war does not eliminate choice. It obscures it, pressures it, and punishes it, but it does not erase it. Even within systems built for destruction, individuals retain the capacity to decide how fully they will participate. The guard chose not to surrender his judgment to circumstance. The prisoner chose to live in a way that honored that decision. Together, they represent a different lineage of heroism, one not defined by triumph, but by conscience. The revelation of their story resonates precisely because it is unexceptional in scale and extraordinary in consequence. No battlefield shifted, no headlines were written, and yet families existed who otherwise would not have. Lives unfolded that would have ended unnoticed. The legacy of that moment cannot be measured in statistics, only in continuance. This is the enduring power of moral courage. It does not demand recognition to function. It does not require certainty of outcome. It acts because not acting would be a surrender of something essential. In that sense, both men became guardians of a principle larger than themselves, that even in the darkest systems, humanity can still assert itself. Their story stands as a quiet indictment of despair. It does not deny the scale of wartime cruelty, nor does it soften its reality. Instead, it insists that cruelty was never total, that within the machinery of death there were moments, brief, fragile, but real, where conscience interrupted momentum. These men were not heroes because they won. They were heroes because they chose restraint when violence was easier, silence when indifference would have sufficed, and responsibility when anonymity offered escape. Their courage did not echo through gunfire, it echoed through time. And that is why they remain unsung. Because the truest acts of humanity rarely announce themselves as such. They move quietly, shaping futures without demanding acknowledgement. They wait years, sometimes decades, to be understood, if they are understood at all. In remembering these two men, history is reminded of something it too often forgets. That even amid ruin, humanity is not extinguished. It endures in individuals willing to choose life over death, dignity over expedience, and conscience over permission. That choice once made does not fade. It remains patient, unrecorded, and profoundly human. In war, relationships are defined by necessity. Allies are trusted because they must be. Enemies are opposed because the structure of conflict allows no alternative. The story of these two men stands apart because it escaped that architecture. What began as a moment of enforced opposition ended as something neither ideology nor time could undo, a bond formed not by shared cause, but by shared humanity. A single act of compassion, carried out without witnesses or expectation, became the foundation of a connection that outlasted uniforms, borders, and half a century of silence. It was not forged through repeated contact or mutual agreement. It was forged in restraint, one man's refusal to let the machinery of war complete its work. That refusal did not announce itself as history. It lived quietly, moving forward inside two separate lives that unfolded far from one another. Yet when those lives converged again, the bond was unmistakable. What remained was not debt or obligation, but recognition. Each man understood what the other represented, not an enemy, not a symbol, but proof that choice had existed when it mattered most. The reflection that followed their reunion was not rooted in sentiment. Neither man sought to romanticize the war that had shaped them. They spoke instead of limits, of how close violence comes to feeling normal and how easily silence can become complicity. In that context, the meaning of their connection sharpened. Friendship did not erase the past, it reframed it. Their relationship demonstrated something history often obscures. That reconciliation does not require agreement about causes or outcomes. It requires acknowledgement of shared humanity at a moment when it could have been denied. The guard had chosen life over convenience. The prisoner had chosen to live in a way that honored that decision. Everything that followed was consequence, not design. As friends, they shared time that felt borrowed from history itself. Conversations unfolded without urgency, shaped by age and perspective rather than grievance. Laughter appeared, not as forgetting, but as release. The war no longer stood between them. It stood behind them, contextualized by the single moment that had refused to let it define everything. The moral closure of their story rests here. A single act of compassion in war became a bond that no battle, no ideology, no passage of time could break. It survived precisely because it had never depended on circumstances remaining the same. It had been rooted in principle, and principle, once exercised, does not expire. Their story offers no grand solution to the problem of war. It does not suggest that individual kindness can undo collective violence. What it proves instead is narrower, and therefore more demanding, that even in the worst conditions, individuals retain responsibility for their choices, and that those choices can echo far beyond the moment in which they are made. Human kindness, the story insists, is not fragile, it is simply quiet. It does not compete with violence on scale or spectacle. It outlasts it. It moves forward invisibly, shaping lives that will never know the moment from which they emerged. It waits, sometimes for decades, before revealing its full meaning. When these two men parted for the final time, there was no sense of loss. The story no longer required continuation. It had completed its long arc, from fear to restraint, from survival to memory, from memory to friendship. The war that had once defined their roles had surrendered its final claim. What remained was something simpler and far more enduring. He was saved by an enemy, and 50 years later, that enemy became a friend for life.